Hey guys, it's me again, that crazy guy who is your professor. Today's lecture is about the textbook, Understanding Comics, which you may be able to find free online. It is a comic book about comic books. It's pretty interesting. Hopefully you've already read it by this time. Otherwise you may be a little lost as I'm talking. There will be a discussion post on this book, but comic books are more complicated than you may think, and more complex. And this is the definitive textbook on comics. So you need to read it, and I'm going to give you kind of an explanation of the most important concepts, the concepts that you'll be writing your first discussion post over. And I'll be explaining them because sometimes they can be a little bit confusing when you talk about closure and we talk about word to picture relationships. So that's going to be the focus of this lecture. I'm not going to cover everything in the textbook. I mean, if you read the textbook, then you know all the other stuff about the history of comics and blah blah blah. So I'm just going to focus on the important parts, the important philosophies. The first thing that you need to understand about comic books is what makes them unique. And what makes them unique, different than film, is that basically the space in between panels, and a panel is one of the words, one of the terms for this comic book. The panel is any kind of shape that's in the comic book that has a picture drawn in it with dialogue or narration or whatever. But the space that's in between two panels is what you call the gutter. And a lot of things happen in the gutter. Your mind has to make a interactive leap between what happens in one panel to the next panel. And that leap, or what happens in between those two panels, is called closure. And there's a few different kinds of closure, but you don't get that anywhere else. You don't get that in movies or film or TV because time is continuous. But in a comic book, you manipulate time. Your mind can spend as much time as it wants on a panel, thinking about what happens between panels in the gutter. Thinking about closure. It's a little bit more up to you how much time you spend thinking on these things. So basically the space in between panels, is how time is controlled in comics, whereas in film it's just constant. There is no space. So the main thing that you kind of need to understand about comics is how their style and how the artwork and all that stuff, how it's kind of chosen by the artist, and how it affects your psychology. Just so you know, on page 20, right there, there's a good definition of comics, and it reads, juxtapose pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence intended to convey information or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. But what you need to know about iconography is in chapter 2. And icons are, pictures, different shapes, different words, things that we get symbolic meaning out of. And they're broken into kind of three categories. Symbols that represent concepts, ideas, and philosophies. Symbols that represent language, like math and science, they're all used for communication. And, pictures to resemble something. And that's, largely what the art in comic books do. A character is supposed to resemble a person or a thing. So the main concept that you need to know, which is in, chapter 3, I believe, between pages 26 and about page 53, which looks like this, is the idea that different kinds of artwork has different effects on your psychology. The more cartoonish that you get, and this is again page 52 and 53, the more cartoonish that you get, the easier it is for you to suspend your disbelief, and your subconscious can plug yourself into the artwork. Kind of like you see when we read the Harlem Hellfighters, the artwork's in black and white. I think the artist, Kanan White, purposefully made kind of race ambiguous in the characters, because you sometimes it's difficult to tell if the characters are white or if they're black, and I think that's one of the points that he makes, so that you can plug yourself in to that character, so that you can sympathize with that character, so you can put yourself psychologically in that character's shoes. And the more cartoonish that the art gets, the easier it is for you to do that. The easier it is for you to identify with that character, for you to plug yourself in. Which is, kind of the strength of that style of artwork, which is, kind of what we get in 300 and, stuff like that. Now, on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, like as we look at this chart, we go this way. When you get more realistic artwork, it's less difficult for you to suspend your belief, but it makes things seem more realistic, and that can have, more power in terms of, raw emotion and how you experience that comic. At the top of this pyramid, we get more into abstraction, where things look, they make sense less in reality. They're a little bit stranger. And, so this is basically how the pyramid works. What they call the art pyramid, or the picture plane. And, basically with realistic art, you get more authenticity. You can see things a little bit more objectively. It's less about the self and more about the content of the comic. Realistic art kind of drags the comic book into the physicality of the real world. It shows its beauty and complexity. It requires really no interaction in terms of translating what's on the page into meaning. But the more abstract you get, the more you get towards cartoonish art, the more it gets towards iconography, like a smiley face or whatever to represent a human. It amplifies the emotion. It requires that you relate to the art a little bit more. And the artwork and its meaning gets simplified symbolically. It's easier to suspend your belief and to relate to the material, and cartoons and that kind of simplicity tend to focus more on ideas, on concepts, and philosophies. So that's the strength of having something more cartoonish, between more realistic. And there's combinations of this. Like sometimes you'll have a really cartoonish character and a very realistic background. And all these choices are stylistic choices because they have different effects on the reader. On page 39, they talk about the two realms. There we go. They talk about the two realms of the comic book. The realm of the concept and the realm of the five senses. Let's see, so, that's useful to look at. Let's see, what else? Chapter 3 also has your term, the gutter, that space in between the panels. And especially what you need to look at, a very key concept, and this is very important in comics, is on page 63. And page 63 has to deal with different types of closure. And closure is what happens in between panels. That's where your brain has to plug in what happens. That's where you interact with the comic. And there's not many places that do that. And there's some good examples of closure in here, definitely. And then when you get to page 70, we start getting different kinds of closure. And I want to explain these because it might, maybe they could get a little bit complicated. I don't know, but here we go. Your first example of closure, page 70, is what you call moment-to-moment closure, where a very short amount of time passes between one panel and the next. And this is not a very common type of closure in American comics. You see it more in Japanese comics, where the focus is more on the art and less on the business, so they take time. With these comics, comic books are longer. They can be like really huge. And moment-to-moment closure requires, very little thought, very little interaction. It's, very brief periods of time, and it can really kind of extend out a moment and focus on a moment. But like I said, it's the least common. Two very common types of closure are number 2 and number 3. And again, this is still on page 70 and 71. And that's action to action closure. And this is what you see most often, in your typical superhero comic books. And, the example in the book is a guy, swinging a baseball bat and then hitting a baseball. It represents simply action.